vivisection is both cruel and unnecessary. And as is usual in these programs, the sides won't be represented by skillful debaters, but by films made quite independently of each other and using technical, design and production facilities provided by the BBC. Both filmmakers have, however, retained complete editorial control, the power to decide how much to appeal to reason or to emotion, how explicit to make their portrayals of vivisection, the technical word for the dissection and treatment of living animals for the purposes of scientific research. The first film that you're going to see, a position decided by the toss of a coin, was made by Caroline Richmond, a former medical researcher and now a scientific journalist. It presents the case for vivisection.
Originally, vivisection meant cutting open conscious animals, and that's been illegal for over a century. But 150 years ago, before anaesthetics, life was often brutal for everybody, including humans and animals. Working-class people who made up most of the British population did heavy manual work. Even children had usually left school and started work in the factory before they reached puberty. Their bodies were peaky and undernourished. They were prey to infections, and their rickety bones broke very easily. The infectious diseases of children were sometimes fatal, and our parents' generation would all have remembered 2 or 3 friends who died in childhood, which doesn't happen now. And diseases like rickets and polio have been eliminated thanks to a lot of research in animals, because you cannot experiment on humans. It is unethical. Before 1922, every child who developed diabetes died within about a year of diagnosis. And it wasn't just a pale, lingering death. They became so emaciated that they looked like creatures out of balsam. They couldn't stand towards the end. Their skin became as dry as parchment and very scaly. They became quite demented. Sometimes they lost their appetite, sometimes they craved foods of all kinds. And then their delirium would lapse into a coma, and at that point the family called in the undertaker. Now, Banting and Best, working in Canada, used dogs to show that extracts from the pancreas of other dogs would cure diabetes, but before they could give them to children, they had to find out how strong their extract was and whether it was safe, so they had to try them out in animals. And even now, every batch of insulin that is ever manufactured, even being manufactured by modern genetic engineering techniques, has to be tested on mice. The mice are given different doses. Too much insulin causes a convulsion, and finding out the level that causes that convulsion gives you an index of the strength of the insulin. And that's the only reason now that diabetics can live. As long as research has existed, so have its opponents. I think they played dirty. For example, they claimed when insulin was discovered that it didn't cure diabetes. They make claims that are unsubstantiated and untrue. They use emotive images which they get from abroad, and the Soviet news agency has been an obliging supplier.
A lot of those animals are stolen for the purpose, and this is why we're here today, to make a formal protest against pet stealing.
And can I put a formal protest?
Certainly, I think the laboratories that have had them have acquired them in all honesty. In other words, people have come to them offering to sell them animals, and they have purported that these were their own animals, when in fact they weren't. But one of the new measures that's been taken by the legislation that's now in force is that it really will be impossible to get stolen pets into laboratories, to sell into laboratories, because they are stipulating very strongly that all animals used in laboratories must be purpose-bred. There are certain exceptions to this, such as wild animals and farm animals, which obviously are going to be very difficult to purpose-breed. And it's only in exceptional circumstances, underlined, that dogs and cats from non-purpose-bred establishments can be used.
I think that it ought to be mandatory for those people who object to the any use of laboratory animals, to actually go to the tropics and see children dying of cerebral malaria, or children with advanced schistosomiasis, or people disfigured by leprosy, or dying of advanced pulmonary tuberculosis. Because I think that what they would come away with would be a feeling of helplessness. People who've been trained as scientists are fortunate in the sense that they can actually do something. And if in doing that it's necessary to terminate the life of a certain number of laboratory mice, then they can see that that is a sacrifice which is, at least in my view, justified when one can actually witness the suffering that goes on in the third world.
These third world diseases are amongst the worst problems waiting to be solved, and we need to find drugs and treatments for them. But is it practicable to develop these treatments using alternative methods without testing them on animals as well?
Well, I would like to think that you didn't have to test them on animals at all, because it's an unpleasant thing to have to do, and it's something which, if one could find alternatives for, we obviously would. It's expensive, it's not exact, but it's the best we have. And I'll give you an example. For instance, an anesthetic drug, if you test it in a tissue culture, doesn't have any effect.
If one accepts that that research has to go on, then the way in which it goes on can be refined to minimize animal suffering. And that's one of the key points made in the new legislation, that any research should cause a minimum amount of suffering consistent with the objectives of the research. And that's a very important statement, I think.
The only abuse of animals I've heard of was some dreadful American research on trauma in conscious animals. The anti-vivisectionists exposed it, and all credit to them for doing so. And the scientists were prosecuted and dismissed from their jobs. But it does raise the question, does the scientific purpose ever require an animal to be in pain?
If I tell you about the type of approach that we take, where we're concerned to understand how damaged tissue signals to the central nervous system, that can be done either in anesthetized animals or in animals with almost all of the brain taken out. And I believe there's no question there that you would not say that those animals are suffering. And I think it's extremely important to stress that it's not only an ethical question. Cruel science is bad science. You do not understand what you are working on. You're working on a situation totally out of control. That's bad science as well as bad humanity.
An animal that's distressed and suffering is out of control, just as a distressed human would be. It's bad for science as well as bad for the animal. Animals themselves have benefited from research on other animals, and even from research on human volunteers.
The best examples, I think, are in the field of vaccines, where, well, up to about 25 years ago, about half the puppies in this country died under the age of 2 years old from distemper. And nowadays, with vaccination, that mortality is cut to perhaps 0.1%. That work was nearly all done on ferrets, so that although dogs have benefited, the work was done mostly on ferrets. The ferrets have benefited too, incidentally, but not to the same extent as the dog.
Can you tell me what changes you've seen that have been made possible by experimental work on animals?
Yes, well, first of all, antibiotic therapy. And this has radically changed modern medical treatment. I think the developments in the last 30 years of the treatment of leukemia and of cancer, great changes, none of which I think could have been done without the help of animal experimental work.
And for example, some of the new drugs that we can thank animals for are the new drugs for ulcers and high blood pressure. First of all, they're tested in animals to see how long they last in the body, whether they're safe, whether the dose that works is much smaller than the dangerous dose, and so on. Ever since the thalidomide disaster, everything is tested in animals to make sure it's safe in pregnancy. And if it's not, then it's not given to pregnant women. And we haven't had another thalidomide tragedy because of animal tests.
In cats, there's a common disease which has become obvious since the more killing diseases, the more infectious diseases were eliminated. And this is so-called feline leukemia, which is again a virus. And the big work on that was done at the veterinary school at Glasgow. And as a result of that work, the United States National Institutes of Health have given the veterinary school a very large sum of money, I believe $2 million, for further work to develop a vaccine against human leukemia.
The possibility of a human leukemia vaccine justifies the research on cats. I think few people would disagree with that. But what about the more contentious areas, like research on cosmetics and toiletries?
I think people tend to interpret cosmetics as being beautifying preparation, but they form a wider base than that. They cover shampoos and toothpaste and many sorts of deodorants.
Do you think it's good animal welfare to test shampoos in the eyes of animals?
Well, it obviously isn't for the animals, but man is an animal as well, remember, and I think it is important that any shampoo that's marketed should have been tested before it's marketed. Now, these tests are going to involve in vitro tests, test tube tests, as well as animal tests. And what we don't want is children getting shampoo in their eyes and then subsequently going blind. The other thing that people tend to forget is there are people with port wine stains who have them removed, or people with burns who are disfigured, who rely on the use of cosmetics to go out and mix in society. Otherwise they'd feel so terrible with these scars that they have, they'd stay inside all the time. So cosmetics does have a therapeutic and medical use, as well as simply a beautifying use.
A regular target for protest has been the Ministry of Defence establishment at Porton Down. Recently, live animals were used there in weapons testing. The hardest thing for anyone to justify is military research. This is an area where the protest is the most vociferous and violent. None of the doctors and scientists we spoke to would want to be associated with it, though none of them has ever had to deal with patients poisoned with mustard gas or wounded soldiers on a battlefield. How many animals were shot, and how does this compare with soldiers who've been killed in wars and civil disturbances?
Well, it was a pretty small number of animals, and of course they were anaesthetized.
Oh, I see.
They were anaesthetized. They anaesthetized them, shot, and then they wanted to examine the extent of the damage which these sort of bullets would produce. After the Falklands War, there was a fairly close investigation in which people compared the quality of treatment which had been given to the British troops and that which had been given to the Argentinian troops. And I mean, there was just no comparison in the quality of medical care. And this is partly because of the knowledge that our people had of the nature of these injuries. Once the chap actually reached medical care, his chances of dying were remarkably small.
But going back to shooting at anaesthetized animals with high-velocity rifles, it still would strike many people as being in poor taste. And I wondered how you felt...
Well, in poor taste, yes, I think it is. It isn't a thing any of us would like doing. But, you know, when you're faced with your men coming in with wounds which have been inflicted by those sort of bullets, you've got to look after them best you can. You want to know as much as you possibly can about the nature of those wounds.
I think animals have as many rights in a way as we give them, because it's a very arbitrary thing to talk about animal rights. I think, if you like, humans have certain rights to a healthy life, and so do our farm pets and our domestic pets.
I'm not after the pursuit of stature as a scientist so much as the pursuit of doing something which is useful to mankind. That may sound very prissy, but I think everybody has to ask certain moral questions about their work, and it's quite clear to me that that is my moral stance.
I think people forget just how cruel disease is to human beings. We don't see poliomyelitis now because we can protect our children against poliomyelitis with vaccine. But every batch of vaccine that is issued has to be tested. You can't be certain that it isn't neurotoxic nerve, that it doesn't poison the nervous system unless you test it. And you have to do this in mice. Do you expect me to do it in children?
The case for vivisection. This second film, made by the Anti-Vivisectionist Society, contains far more explicit pictures of animals undergoing experimentation. The filmmakers insist this is not merely for emotional effect, but because they believe that we have to see what is going on in order to understand the terms of the debate. The debate which the film shows is also about the precise scientific value of this research.
These people are watching videotapes made by American animal experimenters working with the British University.
Now what you're seeing here is research which actually carried out in Pennsylvania. It's joint research with Glasgow University and University of Pennsylvania into brain damage in primates. Now that animal is going to have its head accelerated up to several hundred Gs, and about 10 to 15 Gs can kill a human.
Anti-vivisectionists are often portrayed by the media as a lunatic fringe who are incapable of accepting the necessities of scientific research.
The animal's head had to be put in a casement before it was put in the accelerating device. And the casement was made of dental stone. And baboons tend to have rather hairy heads. The dental stone set to the hair in the head. The only way to release it from that was to wallop them with a hammer. Now that's animals that have already been brain damaged. And they're trying to do extremely delicate autopsies on the brain tissue. And then they thump them with a hammer up to 100 times before they remove the helmet. And one of them actually pulled one of his ears off.
So you're saying that all the research is invalidated when
Totally.
taking the concrete head off?
Totally.
In the next few minutes, we hope to prove to you that far from being a lunatic fringe, people who have had the opportunity to examine the facts have learned that animal experiments are misleading, as well as cruel and unnecessary. We live in a massively drug-orientated society. We've grown to believe that modern medicine has all but eradicated disease, with the credit being given to drugs and vaccines developed on animals. The facts are rather different. Take infectious diseases. The death rate from TB had already dropped dramatically by the time drug therapy and vaccines were widely in use. The pattern for other infectious diseases is fundamentally similar. The historical evidence shows that since Victorian times, the death rates from diseases like diphtheria, measles, polio, whooping cough, and many others had fallen by 90% before antibiotics and widespread immunization. In fact, vaccination for smallpox actually made the situation worse before it got better. Like the other infectious diseases, the death rate was reduced by improved living conditions. Drugs had very little to do with it, compared to nutrition, sanitation, and personal hygiene. But the millions of animals that died for those drugs and vaccines are today replaced by millions more. And it's not just drugs.
All kinds of institutions experiment, from the government to commercial institutions, public health laboratories, Ministry of Defence, manufacturers of household goods, cosmetics, toiletries, the tobacco industry, universities.
This is the Department of Experimental Psychology, which looks like a normal modern monstrosity of a building from the outside. Passers-by won't know, however, that level F of this building, the top floor, is where they keep their experimental animals, monkeys, cats, higher mammals.
There are over 20,000 licensed experimenters and about 500 laboratories in this country. All vivisection laboratories are very security conscious. They go to great lengths to keep their activities out of the public eye. No one has the right to enter a laboratory to see what's going on, not even an RSPCA inspector or an MP.
Getting in there. I would say it's the most secretive area in the whole of the university.
The big secret which the experimenters want to keep hidden from the public is awareness that the difference between humans and other animals invalidates their work. This is the basic scientific flaw of species differences. You can give a mouse cancer, but it will only tell you about cancer in mice. You can mutilate a pig's skin with chemicals, but you won't learn the effect on human skin. You can never be finally confident that anything you do to an animal will have the same effect on us. If you gave a guinea pig penicillin, it would simply die.
Some people could be seen as victims of species differences. The heart drug, Iraldin, was withdrawn after it was suspected of having caused serious lung, eye, stomach, and skin damage to thousands of people. It had been fully tested on animals, but even after the disaster, researchers were still unable to reproduce all the side effects in laboratory animals. Anything that you or I might come into contact with, anything we might possibly eat or drink is tested on an animal at some time or another. Everything for your car, brake fluid, antifreeze, all kinds of household products, cosmetics, tobacco, alcohol.
But are there really alternatives? For instance, the development and testing of a drug usually means testing tens of thousands of chemical compounds. Around 80% of the 3.5 million animals that die each year in British laboratories die in drug-related research and testing. That many animals are an enormous expense. Financial pressure is leading to the adoption of alternative techniques like computer modeling of drug compounds and how they will work in our bodies.
What we're looking at here is a small molecule, one of the thyroid hormones in orange, and one of its receptor proteins in blue. What I'm able to do here is move either both the hormone and its receptor, or move just the hormone itself. In so doing, I can model how the small molecule interacts with the protein receptor to determine what fits and what doesn't fit.
The point about this technique isn't that it replaces any particular animal test, but that not long ago vivisectors argued that you would always need animals to do this sort of research. Financial pressure means that yesterday's scientific truth is today's scientific fallacy.
In general terms, it may take up to 100,000 compounds that have to be made to find every new drug molecule. Using a more rational approach, one may only have to make 10,000, 20,000 compounds. So there's a very significant reduction in the number of compounds which have to be tested.
Computer modeling is only one alternative technique. Vivisectors always argue that alternatives have their limitations, that you need a whole body to make a test. Their problem is that they use the wrong body and still ignore the dangers of species differences. The list of highly accurate non-animal techniques is now so large that a combination of them can already replace all sorts of animal tests. And it's not only tests. A few years ago, the idea of teaching microsurgery, for instance, was thought impossible without using animals.
If you move it down to 10.
Well, what we're trying to do here is to give a training in microvascular surgery. Microvascular surgery is a technique which has been developing in plastic surgery over the last few years. Now, in the laboratory, previously animals have been used, but we wanted to try and create a non-animal alternative. We devised a technique whereby we were putting a circulation into the placenta, and placenta is the largest spare part human material available.
Surgical training, cancer screening, safety testing, analytical techniques, computer modeling, tissue cultures, clinical studies. It would take hours to describe all the alternatives available. If scientists need to find an alternative, they can. But finally, it's also a moral argument.
Well, obviously there's a fundamental moral argument in that if you're using any creature, any sentient being, for your own purposes, without its consent, then you're practicing the morality of the tyrant. The reason we use living animals is because we can use them, because we can oppress them. They can't fight back.
Speciesism is like racism or sexism. It's a prejudice against other sentient, feeling creatures, merely because they're from a different species. Science today produces more and more evidence to show that non-human animals do feel pain in the same sort of way that we do. We have the biological evidence that they need pain for escape and for survival value. We have the behavioral evidence that they scream and writhe in the same sort of way that we do when we're subjected to injury. And we have the new, modern biochemical evidence that animals produce the same transmitters of pain as we do.
I think it's the whole desensitization process. When you have something like animal experimentation, which is a form of institutionalized violence, it doesn't make it any less violent. It just makes it more acceptable to people.
I think there is a danger here that people are being desensitized to something which is important. When I did a survey of school children in Oxford, I found that a very large proportion of them said that dissecting dead animals made them feel very ill and upset them considerably. In other words, there is this natural reluctance to draw blood, particularly cold-bloodedly.
In an ideal world, a relationship, I think, between ourselves and the other species who inhabit the planet would be one of non-harming, non-interference wherever possible. At the moment, it's a very exploitative and a very violent relationship between ourselves and the rest of the planet. I think what we have to see is the members of other species as something more than just a them and us situation. We have to remember that we actually share the one planet. We are all on it together. We're all in the same house, and our relationship with them should be one of non-harming. It's a question of how we behave towards not just each other but the rest of the planet. If we behave badly towards the environment, to other species on the planet, it does eventually reflect badly for human beings.
We've become less arrogant as a species, although we still remain very arrogant as a species. Nevertheless, we're gradually beginning to get ourselves into perspective. We're not the only inhabitants of the Earth. There are many other species here. There is a very important, I think, moral principle here, and that is that man must remain conscious of where he stands in the order of creation.
What's going on here? She doesn't look There she goes. There she goes. She's on TV. Holding her monkey.
Yes, I don't think these people should be regarded as any exception. I think that we can safely say that if someone is going into a laboratory and doing something like that every day, they have got to become desensitized. There's no reason to suspect that these people are any different from other researchers in other parts of the world. I think something you said was very interesting, how the official documents that come out of laboratories are all very much sanitized. And people don't actually realize what those words mean. They don't see what's going on. It's a case of a picture telling 1,000 words.
The argument against vivisection. 20 years ago, it would have been difficult to imagine such a confrontation of opinion. Both sides seemed to live in well-separated worlds. Whilst the anti-vivisectionists were mainly visible in the high street thanks to their leaflets and placards, scientists using vivisection worked quietly away in the laboratories without any sense that they needed to come out into the public to defend their practices. All that has changed. The issue of vivisection has now gone well beyond the laboratory and the high street to become one of the major moral debates of our times. Neither side is now isolated from the other. As we have seen tonight, the debate has been well and truly joined.